Morning, Andy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Helena Wasiun Massaret. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a Gender Programs Officer at Crossroads International. It's a Canadian nonprofit working with 10 sub-Saharan African countries and over 60 plus of our grassroots and women's rights organizations. And we work mostly on advancing gender equality, ending gender-based violence, and strengthening the community-led initiatives, and making sure that our approach and the approaches and institutional interventions of our partners are emphasizing solidarity, prevention, and also transforming the structures that allow violence to persist. So these are principles that are deeply reflected at Crossroads International, and then it's a pleasure for me to be here with this session that brings together national, regional, and international experts who are mobilizing alternatives to punitive systems. So I think I would now like to invite Rachel Bayani, representative of the Baha'i International Communities United Nations Office here in New York, to offer our welcome remarks. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Just first of all, to really thank all of you for being present here. I think the Baha'i International community feels very honored to be hosting this event and opening up this space. We're having so many beautiful conversations, I think, in the past week. And I think something that really came through the conversation is that for a society to be just, you need all levels of society. And you really need the individual, the community, and the institutions to embody this idea of justice. And there is a very strong interplay between them. And that's why I'm very happy that we're really highlighting the community today in this way. And I think something else that came true in the conversations over the past week is this idea that we also need to reconceptualize power, our understanding of power, and that in many ways, when we speak about power, we need to adopt this understanding that it's the power to transform. And if we look at power in that way, power lies within these three levels. Power lies within the individual, power lies within the community, and power lies within the institutions. They, of course, have each their sphere of responsibility and their sphere of action. But I think power is something that isn't limited to one level only. And that, I think, if we have that as an assumption, our conversations look very different. And it's not a fight for power, but it is really this idea that we all have power within us. So thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation. I also want to welcome all of you. And also we have representatives of the government of Canada here, and it's very exciting to be having this conversation. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I think, like you've rightly said, we hope today's conversation will inspire cross-regional learnings and strengthening collective pathways towards transformative justice. Allow me now to invite Deepa Matu, who's the representative of the executive director, actually, of the Barbra Schlifer Commemorative Clinic, who's also our co-organizer for this event. Over to you, Deepa.
Thank you, Helena. And I have to start by thanking Crossroads International and Baha'i International Community for partnering for this roundtable. And I'm really honored to open the space. And during CSW this year, we have had many sustained conversations across side events and parallel events about justice, accountability, and safety for women and gender diverse people. In many of these conversations, it has very clearly standing out for me, at least, that there is no shared understanding of criminalization, and criminalization of survivors is not a neutral space. It is not experienced equally by people, and therefore a conversation with the community-based perspective is really, really important. I want to share a couple of things with you. The Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, has long recognized this reality In Journal Recommendation number 33, CEDA Committee affirms that access to justice must be available, accessible, acceptable, and of good quality, while explicitly acknowledging that intersectional discrimination, including disability, poverty, migration status, and social exclusion, shapes whether justice is reachable at all. Journal Recommendation 35 goes further, recognizing that gender-based violence as structural and cautioning that state responses themselves can reproduce harm and when they fail to reflect lived experiences. For many survivors, particularly those living with disabilities, facing housing insecurity, and navigating poverty, or surviving with precarious legal or social systems, criminal legal response are not pathways to safety. They can trigger loss of housing, loss of income, child welfare involvement, detention, or deportation in case of the migration. At the clinic, survivors regularly tell us that they are faced into impossible choices. These choices are between safety and shelter, between reporting violence and remaining housed, between protection and punishment. These are not individual failures. These are failures of the system design. Legal scholars describe this as jurogenic harm caused by systems intended to protect, but structured without an understanding of how inequality, power, and trauma shape real lives. This is the space we are holding today. This roundtable centers around community-rooted justice approaches, modeled in grounded survivor agency, relationship repair, collective responsibility, prevention, and long-term transformation. These approaches do not deny harm. They do not erase accountability, but they ask questions. What does safety actually look like? Who defines justice? And which system do survivors trust enough to use? Across global contexts that we will be hearing today, communities are already advancing these approaches, often without recognition, resourcing, or policy support. Our work today is to surface that knowledge, learn across regions, and strengthen the case for justice response that are survivor-centered, culturally grounded, and consistent with human rights obligation. Thank you and welcome, everyone. I pass back to Helena.
Thank you, Deepa. And I think you've said it rightly that these are already pathways that are already recognized in the CEDAW, and this long recognition and them being in articles does not necessarily mean that they're really being implemented. And this is something that I think we've all started this conversation even before CSW when we were in Toronto with the Schlifer Clinic, Crossroads, and Baha'i Canada, and especially the Public Affairs Office, where we had a panel of great women across Canada and Uganda who had also touched on gender-based violence and what we need to do as a community to really change this narrative that's always become repetitive at every given event we're having on women's rights. So I'll now move on to our individual reflection segments, and I'm going to open it up to our speakers, but I would like to briefly introduce each of them to you. So on my left, we have Dr. Maulawo Awiti. She is from Ghana, and she's a gender equity advocate, agriculture researcher, and development practitioner who's committed to expanding economic opportunities for women across Ghana and West Africa. So she serves as the executive director of Network of Women in Growth and is also a member of the Network for Women's Rights, NetRight Ghana, where she leads programs that equip marginalized women and young women with vocational, entrepreneurial, and financial skills that enable them to build sustainable livelihoods through agribusiness, micro-enterprises, and climate-resilient value chains. So thank you and welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm just going to finish through the introduction so that I don't interrupt their discussions. And in front of me, our next speaker is Ms. Emily Coyle, who's a Canadian lawyer, advocate, and community leader, currently working as the co-executive director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies in Ottawa. And she's been in this role since 2020, and she co-leads a national organization that is dedicated to supporting criminalized and marginalized women and gender diverse people, focusing on advocacy, public relations, and systemic reforms to address the mass incarceration and marginalization of vulnerable populations, particularly Indigenous women and gender diverse people in federal prisons. So thank you again, Emily, for joining us. Our third speaker is Ms. Marisa Kokoros. who's the founder and executive director of Aura Freedom International, which is also a Canadian organization dedicated to the eradication of violence against women and human trafficking. Marissa has studied the social position of women and performed community research on the broader societal impact of patriarchal violence in different communities and countries, and has also supported survivors of abuse and sexual exploitation in Canada, Italy, Nepal, India, and Kenya. Her work with Aura Freedom has addressed multiple forms of violence against women and children, and she has also managed various humanitarian projects in post-disaster settings in the Global South. So thank you for joining us, Marissa.
Thank you.
And our fourth speaker, who's joining us online, Dr. Andy Thomas, is a governance and capacity development specialist with extensive experience supporting institutional analysis, policy development, and reform in fragile and conflict-affected states. His expertise includes peace building, decentralization, anti-corruption training, organizational change, and context-appropriate institutional designs, alongside work in gender equality, intercultural team building, and participatory strategic planning. He has trained leaders across sectors in policy development, peace and security operations, and performance management. So Dr. Thomas he has worked in the Middle East, Africa, South America, Asia, Haiti, Ghana, and Northern Canada and Alaska, drawing on his background in governance, adult education, community development, and social work in diverse intersectional settings. So once again, thank you. So I'll allow each of our speakers a brief 5-minute reflection to draw from their works and lived experiences to highlight how communities, systems, and movements are creating meaningful alternatives to punitive justice pathways, and what conditions enable survivor-centered, community-rooted approaches to thrive. So these reflections will set the foundation for the deeper dialogue that will follow. So I now invite Dr. Maulawo Awiti to take the floor.
Okay, so thank you very much. And this is my first time at CSW. So thank you, Crossroads. And I'm representing NetRights as a member organization of NetRight. So good morning, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation. I speak today from the perspective of someone who works closely with communities in Ghana, where the reality of gender-based violence is deeply connected to social structures, economic conditions, and cultural dynamics. While Ghana has made progress through legislation such as the Domestic Violence Act and the establishment of the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit within the police service, many survivors still face significant barriers when seeking justice. These barriers include stigma, economic dependence, and limited access to legal services, and the fear of social consequences. For many women, particularly those in rural or economically vulnerable communities, the question is not simply whether justice exists in law, but whether it is accessible, safe, and supportive in practice. This is where community-rooted approaches become critical. In Ghana, communities themselves often play a central role in shaping responses to violence. Families, traditional authorities, women leaders, religious institutions, and community organizations frequently become the first points of support for survivors. When these structures are mobilized in a way that prioritizes survivor dignity and accountability, they can provide pathways to justice that are both accessible and culturally grounded. One important dimension of this work is economic empowerment. Through my work with my organization, we have seen how strengthening women's economic agency can significantly shift the dynamics around gender-based violence. Women who have access to income, skills training, and entrepreneurial opportunities are often better positioned to make decisions about their safety and well-being. Economic empowerment does not only improve livelihoods, it strengthens women's ability to negotiate power within households and communities. In many cases, financial independence creates the conditions that allow survivors to speak out, seek support, or leave unsafe situations. Another critical factor is women's leadership within communities. Across many Ghanaian communities, women leaders play an essential role in mediation, awareness creation, and support for survivors. They act as trusted intermediaries who can engage families, challenge harmful norms, and promote dialogue around gender equality. When women are actively involved in local decision-making structures, it creates spaces where issues such as domestic violence can be discussed more openly and addressed collectively. This community accountability can be a powerful complement to formal legal mechanisms. Equally important are grassroots education and prevention efforts. Community conversations, awareness campaigns, and youth engagement initiatives help challenge the social norms that allow violence to persist. Prevention is often most effective when communities themselves begin to question and reshape the expectations around gender roles, respect, and shared responsibility. However, while community-rooted approaches offer promising pathways, they also face important challenges. One challenge is ensuring that community mechanisms uphold the rights and safety of survivors. Informal systems must be carefully supported to ensure that they do not unintentionally reinforce silence or pressure survivors toward reconciliation where it may not be appropriate. Another challenge is sustainability. Many grassroots organizations and women's groups operate within limited resources, yet they are often at the forefront of responding to gender-based violence. Finally, there is a need for stronger linkages between community responses and formal justice systems. Community-based solutions should not replace legal protections, but rather complement them by making justice systems more accessible and responsive to the lived realities of survivors. Ultimately, what we are learning from the Ghanaian experience is that effective responses to gender-based violence require a holistic approach. Laws and policies are important, but they must be supported by strong community ecosystems that empower women, promote leadership, and foster collective accountability. When communities are equipped with the knowledge, resources, and leadership to address violence, they become powerful agents of prevention and transformation. As we continue this global dialogue, I believe there's much we can learn from local experiences across different regions. Community-driven approaches remind us that justice is not only about punishment, it's also about healing, it's about prevention, it's about dignity, and the creation of environments where women and girls can live free from violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And I think in your reflection, you've explored how community economies and women's grassroots leadership in Ghana and beyond even, because I think it could be true, and we will see it with our other speakers, how it creates empowering non-punitive pathways to justice with that informal mechanisms that are in place, and demonstrates how community-rooted models enable survivors to seek support and accountability outside of the formal punitive systems. So I think building on that importance of community-rooted approaches, I'll now shift to the Canadian context with Emily, who will reflect on how carceral systems impact criminalized and marginalized women, and why non-punitive rights-based alternatives are essential for truly supporting survivors.
Is it both of them?
No, this is a recording.
Oh, okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you so much to the Baha'i Center for welcoming us in this beautiful space. I think it's really a different kind of an environment, and it feels really warm. So I feel really happy to be having this conversation with all of you. So thank you very much for hosting us. So my name is Emily Coyle. As you know, I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the co-executive director at an organization that works with criminalized, marginalized, and people who have been made vulnerable by various systems in Canada. And across our national network, we work alongside also these people, most of whom are survivors of violence in their own lives, many times over, interpersonal violence, but violence that they experience from the systems that they encounter. And those systems, the ones that are ostensibly there to protect us, are the ones that they feel often are the ones that are harming them the most.
And when we speak about intersectionality, and intersectionality feels like an amorphous term, right? Like, what does intersectionality mean? And so when we unpack the word intersectionality, we look at how does intersectional identities affect how a person lives their life? And we forget often about criminalization in the conversation of intersectionality, and how criminalization can actually really keep people in cycles of poverty, cycles of surviving violence and harm, because they can't go to the systems that are there to protect us, because those systems are going to turn them away. Our organization also monitors the conditions of confinement in the federal prisons that are designated for women in Canada. And we see in those federal prisons, but also in our provincial jails, the very real ways in which our social problems are not fixed, but rather disappeared into the prisons. And so when we talk about access to justice, we often start we start from the assumption that justice flows through our policing, through our courts, and through incarceration. And for the people we work with, these systems are not pathways to safety. They're often the source of the deepest harm that they experience. And that's why looking at non-carceral approaches, like Dr. Mawulawo talked about, which moving beyond a characterization of them as alternatives on the margin, but rather pathways that work for the people that we work with. Non-carceral justice starts from that premise, that safety comes from stability, from dignity, as you spoke about, from autonomy, from community, and not from punishment. So we see housing as justice. Stable housing prevents criminalization, which is linked to homelessness, to poverty, and survival strategies. I think about, how sometimes we might have an argument with our spouse inside of our home. I don't know if any of you have had arguments with your spouses. I certainly have not. But perhaps you may have. And if you have had an argument in which your voices were raised in your home, the police aren't generally going to come to your door. But if you are living houseless on the street and you have a partner and you have an argument with your spouse or your friend on the street, you're being surveilled all the time. And that can often lead directly to contact with our criminal system. And so housing is not something that comes after justice, but rather housing itself is justice. We also look at community-based crisis support without intervention of police. And it's not to say that police are not part of the systems that were the other day, but rather what we're trying to do is imagine and create systems that actually work for people who might not want to engage with those systems and feel fear from those systems. Survivors are supported through safety planning, accompaniment, advocacy without triggering surveillance, without triggering child welfare involvement, for example, or immigration consequences, which is, I think, something that Deepa speaks about. The other thing that people need to know in Canada, and is often surprising for people, but not for those who come from Canada, is that 50% of the people in our federal prisons designated for women are Indigenous. If you go to the provincial jails, it can be up 90 to 100% in some of the prairie provinces. And so we really need to look at Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous-led, culturally grounded responses. These approaches are the ones that recognize that colonial punishment cannot repair colonial harm. We talked about that the other day, and that accountability has to be relational, community rooted. Oh man, I already talked for 5 minutes. Maybe 2 more minutes.
Yes.
Okay. And healing centered. And then finally, I also really like to talk about peer-led and survivor-informed support. And I think you talk about that a lot as well. People with lived experience have to lead us. Isolation is then reduced, their dignity is restored, and support becomes credible and effective. Oh, actually one more, which you spoke about, Dr. Mawulawo, which is economic security as violence prevention as well. Income security, employment, access to educational, those are foundational to long-term safety. And so our role at CAFES, and along with all of our partners, is to imagine, to create, to protect, and to scale these non-carceral approaches through our community programs, through our policy advocacy, through our legal interventions, so that they are treated as the norm and not the exception, not the alternative. And for criminalized women and gender diverse people, justice is not about harsher consequences. It's about having the opportunity to heal through real choices, real safety, without being further criminalized. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Emily. And I think for me, like the key takeaway there is, justice for them, designed by them, because it's together. It's not so, like you said, it's not a system that's designed and we expect everyone to fit into it, but it's co-created to work for everyone. So I think with prevention in mind, we will now turn to Marissa, to look at the role of prevention and intersectional education and then addressing the root causes of gender-based violence. So she will speak to us on how community-centered, human rights-based approaches disrupt the conditions that allow, GBV to persist, and how strong connected networks can reduce reliance on the punitive systems. Over to you, Marissa.
Thank you, Helena, and thank you, Crossroads and Baha'i International and Schlifer Clinic for this invitation. I just have a little content warning because I am going to be discussing GBV. I wanted to give an example of criminalization because sometimes it can seem abstract. A few years back, I was supporting a survivor of sexual exploitation in Toronto who was accessing services in the community. And during her trafficking experience, she was forced and coerced to carry drugs for her trafficker, carry arms for her trafficker, to take out bogus payday loans and student loans, and to recruit others into exploitation. She was not chained up and the door appeared wide open for her to leave. Committing those crimes made her safe and made the people she loved safe. Her own criminalization kept her in her trafficker's good books, and anyone who's worked with survivors knows the safest place for you to be is in your trafficker's good books, along with your children if you have any, and she did. Recruiting others was also a way that she was allowed to take fewer clients herself, and in short, it was survival. And many of us, if not all of us, would have done the same thing, if I can be so bold as to say that. In terms of coercive control, her trafficker knew that forcing her to commit those crimes was a way to isolate her from those who cared about her, because there were still people who cared about her, and create more dependency on him. He would say things like, you see, you're just like me. You're a criminal. If you go to the police for help, they won't help you. They will arrest you. And they did. So imagine after years of exploitation and, enduring pretty much the worst of what humanity has to offer, you're then criminalized for your own exploitation. And she's still affected by these charges today, and she will be forever. My name is Marissa Kokoris, as you said, and I'm the founder and executive director of a grassroots organization called Aura Freedom, located in Toronto. And Aura Freedom is a grassroots intersectional feminist organization and registered charity, working to eradicate violence against women and girls and human trafficking through primary and secondary prevention interventions. There's a quote by Desmond Tutu that has inspired my work and Aura Freedom's work since day one. And Desmond Tutu was an anti-apartheid activist from South Africa, as we know. And Desmond Tutu said, there comes a point where we need to stop pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And downstream is frontline response. That's that sacred, crucial pulling people out of the river and supporting them. Crisis support, counseling, housing, maternal care, legal support. That service provision is sacred. I have done it. I have witnessed it, and I've benefited from it myself. But if we really want to end gender-based violence, we must look upstream. Upstream is prevention and eradication. That's where we prevent people from falling in the river or being pushed into the river, as many racialized and Indigenous and Black women are. Upstream is where Aura Freedom works, addressing the root causes of gender-based violence through primary and secondary interventions. And I'll give some examples later on of what that means. And much like the salmon swimming upstream, this work is exhausting. It's invisible. You can't quantify it. It's done quietly. It's hard to point to it. And funders want immediate, tangible results. And even the most progressive funders want fast numbers. But you cannot point to the impacts of primary and secondary prevention within a year or two funding cycle. It takes years to measure changes in attitudes, norms, and beliefs. And like the salmon, many of us will die, right, as we move upstream, but we have laid our eggs and we have created the ripple effects that we need. When it comes to ending gender-based violence, laws and policies are secondary. Hear me out. Can good legislation make a difference? Absolutely. Strong feminist legislation has improved the lives of many women around the world, from making divorce legal to addressing pay gaps and more. And as an upstream organization, Aura Freedom will always back good legislation that's been informed by the community and that's carefully considered all potential harms. It's actually a huge part of our work. We submit lots of briefs to FIWO. We do a lot of this work. But the truth is, most laws will do very little to uplift communities and prevent violence. Instead, it responds downstream when the violence has already happened, when that trauma has already ripped through that family. And what's more, when we look at the amount of women who are accused or charged with crimes when they are in fact survivors themselves, we see where the nuances and complexities lie. We must recognize that true societal change hinges on the willingness of governments and leaders to address the root causes of violence against women. And what we need are serious investments in primary and secondary prevention that address gender inequality, misogyny, racism, colonialism, homophobia. And we need to do this in permanent, large-scale, forever ways embedded in our systems. This is what eradicating violence looks like. And many of our organizations, like Aura Freedom, do this work invisibly and are constantly struggling for funding. Some of us have been working for decades in the community, and our names are not known to funders who aren't aware of what's going on in the ground. Or we do receive funding from, let's say, Wage or the province, but it's for 1 or 2 years. And if downstream work is already hanging by a thread at the best of times, then upstream work in some jurisdictions, funding for it does not even exist. So change is possible. I truly believe that. I still believe that. But it all hinges on political will to look up, to look upstream.
Thank you for that, Marissa. And really, I think you've really summarized all our challenges of where the interest is in the immediate results, and they would want that immediate results to be sustainable. But then that's not something feasible, because the norm change, the attitude change is something that takes time and repetition, as we said at the beginning of our session today. So to round us out, on our reflections, and we will turn to the systems that we all spoke of and the structures that shape how our justice responses systems are shaped right now, or even how they've evolved. So I want to invite Dr. Andy Thomas, who will explore the conditions that are needed for shifting from the punitive models to community-based, survivor-centered approaches, and why carceral systems persist, and what systems thinking or adaptive leadership could reveal about, the barriers or opportunities for transformation. Over to you, Dr. Andy.
Thank you very much, Helena. I'm going to do all that in 5 minutes. Yes. I'll give it my best shot. One of the things that my current role is I'm the co-chair of the research committee of an organization called Men's Shed Canada. Men's Shed is a network across the country and a number of other places where older guys get together and provide mutual support to each other. One of the things that we found is that the identity formation process, then it's rooted in the early socialization process, has resulted in some serious problems when older guys retire. Their identity sort of falls through the gaps, falls through the floor. And we've been looking at where does this happen and how does this happen and what kind of institutional framework can we put in place to remedy this process. The government of Quebec did a very interesting analysis. They did a whole system profile of well-being. How is well-being distributed across the society? And then they started putting programs in place to deal with the anomalies in that. And one of the major things they found was male identity formation processes are, as a couple of people have mentioned, are upstream of a number of dysfunctions which show up in different other scale of life. And if we consider that the world is undergoing a fundamental transformation from a balkanized us and them kind of framework to there is no them, there's just different kinds of us. And over the last 150 years, 200 years or so, the boundaries which held different groups of humanity in their enclaves or in their clusters, those boundaries have been blown open. And now forces and people are free to move freely across the world. We see them in boats in the Channel, and we see internet influencing across the world. These patterns are producing a turbulence, which is very troublesome, but it's a process which is undergoing a fundamental change in the whole structure of human society and the character of human beings. And we now are in the face of trying to correct some of the processes which were dysfunctional in these various clusters. One cluster is the male-female cluster, and the principles of justice need to apply very clearly in the relationship between male and female. And also we have the concept of othering. To use a punitive model to try to solve a problem is to presume that the bad guy is an other. He's not one of us. And so there are models that are working to reconcile that. The Aboriginal communities, I think someone mentioned, they're using community healing circles and sentencing circles rather than punitive models to deal with people who are accused of committing atrocities of some sort. And this is based on the notion that we really are all one, and that we need to somehow achieve new sense of how we relate to each other. And this is a tall order. This is not an easy transition to make. So gender-based violence is sort of one of the symptoms of a deeper level dysfunction in terms of I feel that I can do you harm because you are other. You are not like me. And so the education process and the socialization process that brings people to that condition is being addressed. The Canadian federal government recently launched a national conversation on the well-being of boys and men. I was at this meeting in Parliament where there must have been a couple of dozen parliamentarians and senators and so forth. The process is led by two women. The Minister of Health and the Minister of Gender Equality are both women, and they both said that we need to have equality or equivalence between male and female if our society is going to advance. And so there now is a process which is launched to create a national policy to create a program for dealing with the challenges found among men and boys. Australia, Ireland, and a couple of other countries have programs dealing with men's well-being. In Canada, the process is fairly early, but it seems to be moving quite quickly now, and we're very encouraged by that. I could talk some more about this, but I think that's about it for now. We have lots of road ahead of us before we achieve an appropriate relationship between the two wings of humanity, male and female, that both need to be fully developed for humanity to advance. And justice is a key element. What is how do we define justice in these different sets of relationships? We're working on that as a global society, and we're not done yet. We'll probably have it done by next Wednesday, but I don't think so. Okay, that's about it for me for now.
Thank you, Dr. Andy. And I think you've touched on a very key thing for me. Like, for the past 6 years or so working in international development, a new term was coined, which was positive masculinity or male engagement. And I was 3 years back, before moving to Canada, I was working on the African region. And that was then, I think we even had at the African Union level, the president of DRC was the champion at the continental level on positive masculinity. So it shows that there is recognition of what the upstream, one of the bottlenecks is, and what work needs to be done. So but the thing is, it's fragmented on the approaches, and sometimes it's tokenized engagement, male engagement. So we need to go back to the drawing board of including the education, and how do we make sure we shift the thinking and the norms, the attitudes. So I think I want to thank all of our speakers for those insightful reflections. I think now I'm going to move us to the next section, where I'm going to give you a bit of more time, but still, I'll be very strict this time. I'll cut you off if you go over time. Apologies in advance. But it would be an opportunity to, go in depth and draw some of the connections of what you've already raised across the different contexts. So I'll go back again to Dr. Maulawo, and drawing, from your work in Ghana, as you have already touched on. How do community-driven and women-led approaches create trusted, effective alternatives to punitive gender-based violence systems? And what opportunities or challenges emerge when these community-rooted models are being scaled up? Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to share a story. I realized one thing when I came here is when you're going to share a story with some sort of details, you have to give a disclaimer. So let me just give a disclaimer. So I'm going to share a story about something that recently happened, I think last year in Ghana. And I'm just going to touch on the importance of social media and how that has been a community approach to supporting survivors. So last year, a young lady at her window did a recording of her landlord beating the wife. And that was a very graphic thing that we saw. And it was put on social media. And everybody that was on social media saw how the woman was battered by her husband. Mind you, this woman is recording her landlord. So she's risking her life doing this. But there was a whole uproar on social media and in Ghana. And CSOs, everybody rose up and spoke against it. What happened next? The man was arrested. But did that save the woman? No. We had a situation where family members of the man came to the home and wanted to beat the one who recorded this incident. And even they were looking for the wife. We had situations where the wife had reported the man several times to the police. But then again, she still had to come back home. Why? Because this is the man that she's dependent on, the man who takes care of her. But the fact that that lady was brave enough to share, and the whole community, that is everyone in Ghana, rose up and spoke against it, meant that the justice system could not be silent. This man was arrested. Apart from that, communities came together to give for this woman to be supported. So now she has stability. She has a place of her own, and she can go back to her family. That is the power of social media, and how that has come to bring a key approach to supporting survivors in Ghana. This is just one of the many examples I'm given of what we are using social media to do in Ghana. Now, One of the key approaches we are using also in Ghana, like I said, is about women's economic empowerment, because we do realize that when women do not have something of their own, it's very, very difficult for them to stay away from their abusers. There are so many situations where my mom has taken women away from abusive relationships, but they still have to go back. Why? Because they don't have something of their own. But giving a woman a choice, the ability to learn skills that allows her to earn something of her own, that makes her take care of her own family, gives her a voice, it gives her a place. Because sometimes we have situations where families are not willing to even take you in because you are being abused by your partner. You hush it up, reconcile with your husband, talk about it, we'll meet as a family and discuss it. But giving women that financial independence has been a key approach to supporting survivors. And also, there is awareness campaigns. Women have done a lot in Ghana. For the Domestic Violence Act to be an act now, it meant my mother, my grandmother had to go on the street and demonstrate and create awareness to be able to bring a spotlight to women and the challenges they face. Years back in Ghana, if your mother goes out and she's not back home after a certain time, you are worried. The next thing you will see on the news are women who have had to be affected based on their gender. And there were so many reports on the news, but women rose up and spoke against it, which got the government to act. So yes, awareness campaign is a key approach that we have used. Engaging men and boys is also very important. We understand that it is not a fight. It is a conversation that we are having. Like we said, positive masculinity. How do we as women engage our males, our traditional leaders, for them to understand the harmful effects of gender-based violence? A key approach is also challenging some of our societal norms which are harmful. And a lot of the times we do this using theater. So how do we use theater? In the context of our community. So you don't bring something out of the community, but contextualize it using theater, just to be able to challenge a lot of these harmful norms. And when you do that, when you come out, the conversations that you have with the leaders, it makes sure that they really now, and when you are sitting outside and watching, it's different than when you are actually being the one doing the harm, because then you ask yourself, if that was my daughter, that was my sister, that was my mother, would I watch that happen to her? So we find that using theater is also a very key in the context of the community we work with. It's very important. Then we have local leadership engagement, because we need to engage with our traditional leaders in Ghana. They are very, very key. Emily talked about having an interaction with the king of the Ashanti Kingdom coming. That shows you how powerful our traditional leaders are in Ghana. So we have a lot of engagement with them. We also work with religious institutions, Christians, Muslims, just have those conversations with them. And then women leaders, we work with a lot of women leaders in the various communities, the market queens, because they also have they play a very critical role, and they create a safe space for other women to engage. Then community reporting and support systems. So we have that peer networking system where women can engage with each other and provide that safe space and have a safe haven for other women to also enjoy. These approaches are critical and they gain trust. Why? Because they are culturally familiar, they are accessible, they are survivor-centered, and they are locally led. And so these are going to be my...
Thank you so much. And I think I like how you ended it with it being accessible, culturally sensitive, because look, we all call for multi-sectorial approaches and for the different actors that are needed for the GBV responses to work in tandem to make sure that you are responding to the needs based on what works and what is needed by the community for the community, as we said earlier on. So I think building on that, we now shift again back to Emily for the Canadian context, and she'll speak to us based on her work with criminalized and marginalized women and how carceral systems harm survivors and what non-carceral right-based alternatives can show in terms of potential to replace punitive measures. Over to you.
Thank you. And I'm just struck as you're speaking that we have so many similar strategies. And we were speaking before this discussion began that we've been saying these same things over and over again. We know what works, we know what works. And our governments continue to respond with criminal legislation as a response to gender-based violence and then say, well, we're done. And I think that that's the problem that we keep facing. And so when we look at the prison system, for example, in Canada, and how that compounds harm, it reproduces the dynamics of control and surveillance that people who are experiencing gender-based violence have had their lives in other aspects of their lives as well. And so it mirrors that abuse. It re-traumatizes people who are survivors rather than supporting their healing. And I can tell you why. So we have a prison system that ostensibly is rehabilitative, right? That's what our goal is. We want rehabilitation in systems. And I was talking to the executive director of the Elizabeth Fry Society of Toronto, and she runs the group of women who have been charged and convicted of domestic violence in their own relationships. So violence against their spouses, their partners. Invariably, those partners are male. And this program, which is an Ontario provincial program, requires people to take accountability and to apologize for the harm that they've caused. And 100% of the people who are going through that program, whether they're women or gender diverse or trans folks, say, why am I being made to apologize when I was responding to the harm that I had been experiencing for years and years and years? And I think back to what Deepa has used as an example, when women or gender diverse folks respond to the violence that they've been experiencing. Sometimes they're running away, sometimes they're throwing a doll or a toy, and that then becomes assault with a weapon. And that is the crime that that person is now convicted of and has to go and make penance for something that she has been experiencing her whole lives. And then when they get to prison, prisons are designed to manage populations, not to care about the individuals who are there. And I can give you many examples of that, but really it's not that the people who are there who are running them are inherently bad. It's it's the opposite. We have lots of relationships with the wardens who run these prisons. Some of them are great people, but they are looking at how to manage populations, right? It's not about the individual's story, generally speaking. The other thing is we have the criminalization of survival. So we talked a lot about that already. They're often punished for acts of self-defense. I just said that, poverty-related survival strategies. And Marissa spoke about an example of someone who was trafficked, and I'm hoping that you will all also understand that there's a bit of a trigger warning here as well. I met recently with a 19-year-old who came to Canada as a refugee from Haiti with her mom. And when she was 16, her mom died. And she was left sort of untethered, unanchored. And she started, finding ways to make money. And the way that she did that was she was doing sex work. And then, the people she was involved with said, well, why don't you get your friends to come and do the sex work too? So she did. And now she, as a 19-year-old, is in prison for trafficking. And she's like, I don't know if you're a parent, but I have a 21-year-old, I have a 17, almost 18-year-old. 19 is very, very young. And now she's in prison with an adult prison. And this is going to follow her for the rest of her life. The disproportionate impacts, we talked a lot about Indigenous people. It's not just Indigenous people who experience the disproportionate impacts of criminalization. It's also Black people, immigrants, disabled people, trans folks who experience heightened surveillance, harsher classification. I always give an example of the Gladue reports in Canada. So in Canada, we do Gladue reports, which is something that is supposed to look at Indigenous social history and mitigate sentencing. But when a person goes into prison, those same factors that are mitigating at sentencing are those factors become risk in prison, and Indigenous people are invariably classified at higher security levels because of the risk that they apparently pose to the prison system, which means that those Indigenous people cannot cascade out faster than that. I also talked a little bit about family and community destabilization earlier, but more importantly, the failure to prevent harm. If we really cared about victims, survivors, we would be doing everything we could to prevent them from experiencing harm in the first place. We would be putting all of our energy into that. And so why non-carceral approaches are more effective? They define safety as stability. We already talked about housing, income, healthcare, community connections. They restore people's agency and choice. Survivors get to determine what safety looks like for them. They reduce exposure on state surveillance, which we talked about already. They're often trauma-informed and healing-centered because they come from the people themselves who design them. They support accountability without exile. And I think that harkens back to what our friend was saying. Dr. Andy. Because, you know, if we fragment our populations, we will continue that fragmentation in cyclical ways. And they prevent future criminalization. That is the biggest part for me too. It's not about doing less. In fact, it's about doing more and what actually works. If we invest in community, dignity, autonomy, we create safety that punishment has never been able to deliver for all of us, safety for everybody in our communities, including, you know, people who are not criminalized yet. Thank you. Did I talk too long?
No, it's all right. Right on time. Thank you so much for that. And I think prevention is what we're calling for, and because right now our systems are more responsive as much as we need them, but we need to strengthen our preventative methods. So you've highlighted those, you know, profound limitation of the carceral responses, where oftentimes, or majority of the times, the last measures of self-preservation or protection that women take or try to take become a double-edged sword where it harms them more. So I think now looking at prevention again, we're coming back to Marissa from the intersectional human rights and prevention standpoint with communities. How can education and grassroots engagement address the root causes, the upstream, as you've phrased it earlier, on how we respond to GBV and how we prevent and mitigate? Over to you.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify that prevention very often is embedded in a lot of frontline work. They'll say that we do prevent violence. And tertiary prevention is when violence has already occurred and you're either preventing someone from returning to an abuser, you're doing risk assessments for femicide perhaps, and there is some prevention involved. But when we talk about prevention, or what we do at Aura Freedom, is we try and focus on primary and secondary. Now, what does that mean? So while we wait for this, you know, utopia and this change, we need to work with the systems that we have. We have to work within what we already have. 2 years ago, our organization submitted a really robust, multi-pronged framework to the province of Ontario for their study on intimate partner violence. Within this submission, and I'm happy to share it, it's also available for free. You can download it from our website. We provide specific examples. And I want to clarify that when we advocate for primary and secondary prevention, it's not at the expense of the front line. It's in addition to it. Because we cannot take away crisis services. That's a siren going off, right? But just as blaring is the siren that's happening upstream. So I just want to clarify that it's in addition to the frontline work. Primary prevention refers to strategies and actions designed to prevent gender-based violence from happening at all in the first place. Creating those societal shifts, sure, engaging with men and boys, community resilience and housing, a lot of reducing risk factors and really increasing those protective factors. There are numerous reports in our country, the MMIWG final report, the mass casualty report, the Renfrew County inquest. They all point to the importance of primary prevention. But these brilliant reports, right, that ripped open the hearts of the communities that created them are not binding. So they have these wonderful recommendations that are kind of sitting on shelves. Without primary prevention, we accept gender-based violence as the status quo. And what happens is we'll continue to see that revolving door of shelters. We'll see a survivor come with her kids, leave, and another one show up, and a survivor leave, and another one show up. Without primary prevention, that downstream revolving door will never end. The constant crisis services, healthcare, addiction, mental health, legal, employment, substance use, all of it. Examples of primary prevention are some of them, and Dr. Adjua mentioned this. School-based programs, teaching healthy relationships and consent and equity, working with men and boys, creating public resources for education on GBV and IPV, and I mean in large-scale ways. Like if you grew up in the 80s and 90s, it was cigarettes and seatbelts. We knew we would die if we didn't put our seatbelts on, and we knew we would die if we kept smoking because it was embedded everywhere. They took a healthcare approach and they really embedded it. That's what we need to do for GBV. Initiatives that address the way GBV is portrayed in the media. And Aura Freedom's GBV in the Media project is working with journalists. Journalists tell the stories of our time. They affect the way we talk about things at the dinner table. They affect the way even older generations or younger generations think about certain issues, and then the way we address them, the way we understand them. Financial literacy programs, childcare programs, parenting programs, this is all primary prevention. Secondary, also known as early intervention, is focused on providing support and resources to individuals at risk of experiencing violence or of perpetrating violence. Maybe they're youth in care, right? Maybe they're youth who are in foster homes or in group homes or who have committed petty crimes. And that's getting to them. And so there is a risk, a heightened risk, and then certain populations, racialized populations in Canada, Indigenous populations, we want to really cover the communities in support and in community resilience that looks like what it needs to look like for them. Examples in this pillar are support for men and boys who've experienced child abuse, parenting programs for new parents, or parenting programs for survivors of sexual exploitation or abuse. Early intervention initiatives can prevent the escalation of violence as well. The sad truth is most prevention programs are not embedded in systems right now in Canada. They're being carried out by civil society on shoestring budgets. And it's not sustainable, it's not scalable, and it falls short of the epidemic or really the pandemic levels of funding needed to address this. So I can share our more examples. Training and capacity building for frontline workers, where Freedom trains frontline workers in understanding criminalization and using a non-punishment principle in their work, and how they can start building their own systems of support that go beyond the punitive measures or the carceral measures. I was at a police human trafficking conference. I can't believe they asked me to speak there because I'm not a fan of the way they do anti-trafficking work in Toronto, but I was invited to speak. I said, wow, this is a great opportunity. And I had an officer actually say to me, I know when I'm working with a girl, if she's recruiting others, that she's doing it for the trafficker, but I have to arrest her. This is what we're working with. So training police, training frontline workers, healthcare workers, public education campaigns, and so much more. So
thank you. Thank you, Marissa. And I think education at all levels, not just early education, to make sure the next generation does not repeat the same mistakes that we're living on, but making sure that even those of us that are set in our ways shift our attitude. So capacity buildings, education, re-education, reskilling throughout our systems. So we go to our final intervention from Dr. Andy to look at what shifts in governance or leadership or community structures are essential to move from the punitive model towards the community-based justice. And if you could give like one systemic barrier that must be overcome to make this transformation sustainable. Over to you.
Sure, thank you very much. One of the tools which is being used to address the problems that we're discussing here is the community sentencing circles that we find among a number of Aboriginal communities. These began in the Yukon when Chief Justice Barry Stewart teamed up with one of the leaders of the Tlingit community to find a better way of dealing with the kind of violent behavior that was problematic in the community around Carcross and Tagish and places like that. That process brought together the perpetrator and the victim, plus other people in the community, plus the law enforcement people and the justice people and so forth. And they had a chance to sit and talk with each other about what went on and what the impact of it was and so forth. So the perpetrator or the accused heard from his peers or her peers, the aunts and uncles and cousins and neighbors, about what was going on. The effect of that on the accused was that they tended to align their behavior more with the community norms. So there was a caring kind of dimension in the process rather than a punitive dimension. Look at what you did to me. This is the effect that it had on my family, you know, these kinds of things. And in a collectivist society, that kind of approach tends to work. However, many of the societies that we're talking about have an individualist kind of cultural underpinning. And one of the jobs I did when I was in the development business was to look at the organizational analysis of the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Afghanistan. I worked there for 10 or 15 years in Iraq and other such places. And what was interesting is that the Ministry of Women's Affairs was promoted by UN Women. And UN Women approached the challenges in the society from a Western individualist approach. And what we found when we talked with the Afghans that were involved in this is that they just could not connect with that approach. What they found was that the approach was advancing women, but did not place the men and women in context. They did not relate to the reality of these people live in a community, and there's a number of different actors, and there's an interdependence among all of these actors. I lived for 3 years as a social worker on the coast of Hudson Bay. I was working for the government of the Kuwaitan at the time, and it was during the women's lib process. And the older Inuit women told me, women's lib, we don't need that. The men went out and hunted, and when they brought back the game, we made the clothes so that they could go and hunt. There was an interdependence among the various actors, which produced a climate in which the tensions and the stresses could be worked out. They needed each other. And we found the same thing in Afghanistan, is that the Afghans said that the approach that the UN Women was promoting was fostering family divisions, increased divorce rates and things like that. And we looked at the models in collectivist societies that they did on advancement of women. We found that these ministries were called things like Ministry of Family and Community Affairs, Ministry of Education and Community and Family Affairs, rather than what we have in most Western societies is the advancement of women, which needs to happen, there's no doubt about that. But to remove that process from the context within which people live is problematic. So if we're moving to a oneness model of society, we're reducing otherness, and we're starting to shift into a usness rather than a we and themness. Those processes of working stuff out among the actors in a way which is infused with principles of justice, those processes then have a better chance of advancing the agenda of achieving a more equitable and better coping mechanisms in the society rather than violence and incarceration and so forth, which was so well identified as problematic. That's about it for now.
Thank you so much. And I think in one word, it's the one size fits all is not the solution. It's with any of the UN protocols and legal or international frameworks, there's always the word of domestication that is used. So when they ratify and then they domesticate, they're trying to see how that law or framework would look in that country and how it would respond and how it needs to be adopted to respond to that context. And it's that thought we need to bring at each level, because even within any country or region, there are further intersectionalities from community to community, from neighbors to neighbors even. So thank you all once again to all our speakers for these thoughtful and powerful insights. So we've heard different perspectives on community innovation and carceral approaches, prevention, and system level transformation. So we're now going to open it up to our audience, those that would have comments, interventions, or questions. I also recognize that we do have some participants online. So if you do have questions, comments, please share it in the chat, and we'll have our colleagues in the room share that with us. So while I give all of you a few minutes to gather your thoughts on the reflections, let me just give Rachel the opportunity to share your a reflection. Oh, we have a hand. Okay, we'll come back to that. Go ahead and
You're taking me by surprise. No, I really, truly very much enjoyed this conversation. And I think this idea of prevention and sort of the slow work actually of it. And I think we have to be very, very realistic, because sometimes we also think things get quickly fixed by the adoption of a law or a policy, but actually the transformative work is sort of a long kind of daily and kind of, how do you say that, work actually. And I think we need to realize that. And I really love what you said. I love what all of you said, but just to highlight what Marissa said about it not being measurable immediately. And I think, what does it mean for it not to be measurable, but still, how can we acknowledge the successes of it? And I think that's something we need to better understand and weave into even the policy discussions. So that is something that sort of struck me. And then again, this idea of really this individual and community-based transformation. How can we have that started without necessarily an input by institutions? That's a question that I have. Because always, if that is the condition, then sort of we're limiting ourselves. Of course, institutions support and they encourage and they may accompany, but we actually need to have mechanisms by which that individual and community-based transformation doesn't hinge on institutional sort of input. And I think that's a question we need to ask ourselves. And that doesn't mean institutions are irrelevant at all. We need, I think it's very, very clear that we need all three actors and sort of transformation at all three levels. But I think, how do we not, they are interdependent, but how do we not make the sort of the initiation of one dependent on the other? That's a question I'm asking myself.
Thank you for that, Rachel. So I'll allow the speakers, I don't know who would want to respond to Rachel, but to think of if you have a quick response to that.
I can respond very quickly. I don't have an answer because I don't think the answer is black and white, but putting trust in the organizations to do the work they know how to do the work. And it is evidence-based, even though it does take a while. We do know what works. I spent time in South Asia doing a lot of research on child marriage and human trafficking. And in one community where the child marriage rate was 70%, the leaders of the community were trying to reduce and were trying to provide education. And the innovative questions that we were asking and that the community came up with to see change was, after this program, this education program went through the community, they were asking girls before the program and after the program, do you have 3 friends that you trust to tell if you're to talk to if you're in trouble? And before the education came through and after the education came through. And these are just examples of questions and of ways. There are ways to measure change, but again, we have to be in it for the long run. So there's innovative ways to ask very creative questions to track change, but they're not going to be quantitative. They're always going to be qualitative.
Thank you for that, Marissa. I see we have a hand online on the Zoom. Deb Atabora, you may open your mic and share.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Deborah Tubra. I'm the director at the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy at the University of Ghana. And I have very much enjoyed the presentations. I do agree, and many of us in this field think that the legal provisions, although are very, very important and give us the legal basis to ensure that punitive measures are implemented, they seem very inadequate, especially within the context of low resources in many African countries. But in this conversation, I very much looked forward to hearing perspectives on how, for instance, areas such as cultural psychology could also be important in defining the methodologies that we use to augment the legal provisions. And I'm saying this because over the years, we still do not clearly understand why men and, generally people continue to perpetrate gender-based violence on others. Even in contexts where punishment is common, you will still find violence, abundant. We have talked about how to engage cultural bearers and custodians of culture, such as chiefs, and so on and so forth. But my reservation there is, in very patriarchal systems, we know very much how patriarchy defines culture and defines what happens within communities. And so then we come back to the same situation. And then we have a stand block and we don't see things change. We have also had a very long history, when we look into our history, of, endeavors to control male sexuality in ways that eventually hurt women. For instance, in Akan society in Ghana, there's a long history in the 1600s, 1500s of where public women, women who were slaves were kept to be used by men who could not control their sexuality. And these and other events make me think that resorting to work with traditional leaders may not be the most viable methodology. We know from the literature and research that oftentimes when there are perpetrators, it's these same leaders who come in to appeal and to plead on behalf of the perpetrators, the powerful people in society. And so I think one of the ways, so I'm trying to round up now, how do we apply social sanctions such as shame, loss of opportunity, and other forms of social punishment to perpetrators, even when the legal punitive applications or measures are not fully applied. And at the same time, women who fall victims, how do we move away from stigmatizing them to a place where the society applauds them, so that even if they do not see the perpetrators being punished, they will still be, pacified in some way and not rather slide into negative reaction by community. And I think that fields like psychology can help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. I think there are a lot of questions to unpack in there, but let me ask our two legal practitioners in the room if they want to tackle a few of it, because I know, Emily, it's part of your work as well, because, working with Indigenous communities, working with that community, marrying the community approach with the legal approach. So let me maybe hand over to you first, and then we'll see if others also have a response.
Okay, Helena, I have a comment to make as well when my turn comes.
I'll come to you as well, Dr. Andy. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm not going to take a lot of time because I think Deb hit on a really important point, which is if we continue to have patriarchy as the structure into which we are building systems, it will continue to replicate the patriarchal response. And so even if we talk about relying on culture or community as an alternative to the system that we've created, if the community is still based in patriarchal values, it will continue to replicate the patriarchal response and the punitive response. And so I think what you were getting at was, how can we have accountability that is real and affects change? Because we continue to see, even in punishment-based societies, which we all live in, that gender-based violence is replicated over and over again and is not stopping, no matter how many sanctions we put on it. So it's a good question. I don't think we have all the answers yet, but we move towards them, right? As we continue to have these conversations and we expose patriarchy for how it not only harms women, but also harms men. And I have to say, we're talking a lot about binary here, but there's also, gender diversity in this conversation, and gender diverse people are also harmed by the patriarchy in specific ways. So.
Very true. Okay, Dr. Andy, I'll come quickly to you.
Okay, thanks. The comments are just outstanding. One of the things that a development project that CIDA did, Canadian International Development, did some years ago, is that they put funding available to the communities for development projects and said that the decision-making process around where those funds are to be distributed need to have 50-50 participation between the men and the women in the society. That project, and of course the leaders, the men, grumbled about it, but they couldn't get the money unless they had some women in the room to participate in the decision-making process. That project came to an end in 3 or 4 years, but that participatory consultative process endured. What everybody found was that they were making better decisions because the voice of 50% of the population was present in the decision-making process. And so the guys did not kick the women out of the room, quite the opposite. The guys said, hey, we need your input. The same process was applied in Afghanistan. The National Solidarity Program had small funds that they distributed to communities with the proviso that they recognized that male and female represent the two wings of the society, and both need to be fully active and engaged. And if you didn't have that in your decision-making process, you didn't get any money. And the communities, well, since the Taliban have become the de facto government, I don't know if that process still holds, but it was very interesting that the initial resistance to that melted when people found that there were higher quality decisions. The government of Norway has apparently put in place mandatory
sorry, Dr. Andy,
measures to deal with women on boards of governors. Okay, go ahead.
I apologize to cut you off, but we're running a bit late on time, so I want to come back to the room so that we wrap up. But I think these are interesting conversations, and this is the essence of CSW, the 2 weeks that all of different actors from government, civil society, NGOs, and youth are here for this conversation. So we have beyond this session as well to continue this conversation and to continue learning from each other. So I once again thank all our speakers. I want to see if there's one final intervener before I hand over to Deepa to close us off. Okay, we're good. All right, then I hand over to you, Deepa, so that you can give us closing reflections for today.
Thank you so much. So as we close today, what stands out for me is that there was diversity of perspectives shared today, but all of those diversity of perspectives also deeply aligned with each other. So across the insights of Dr. Malawi, Emily, Marissa, and Dr. Andy, there were some common threads that emerged. They were around healing, prevention, and community-led justice. There was conversation about peer support, education, engagement across sectors, art, faith-based, and culturally familiar approaches, and meaningful engagement of communities, families, and men. There was a shared critique of system, including flaws of system design, prison system, the failure to rehabilitate, address trauma, instead deepen harm with those systems. Above all, we heard a clear call to prevent future criminalization of communities most at risk, particularly Indigenous, Black, racialized communities, by confronting discrimination at structural level and ongoing failure to prevent harm. So quoting Arundhati Roy, never complicate that is simple and never simplify that is complicated. I do say that the guardrails from patriarchy and misogyny are needed at any system design or new design of the system. In the space of CSW, it is important to acknowledge that CEDAW gives us a clear framework. Survivors give us clear evidence, communities give us clear practices. If we are serious about ending gender-based violence, we must move beyond system that causes harm in the name of protection or towards justice response that is not grounded in dignity, accountability, and collective care. So thank you for the depth and the generosity that you brought to this space. Let's carry this work beyond CSW and into the sphere of influences, big or small. And my sincere gratitude to Baha'i International Public Affairs Office. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Baha'i International Canada, Crossroads International, and Schlifer Clinic, and all my colleagues here who joined for this conversation. Thank you so much. Happy CSW for the rest of the week.